Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give people a few moments to come in here. So bear with us. We'll get going in just a little bit. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Kate Seeley with NCG, and I'll be moderating this session today. We're just giving folks one more minute to join. Okay, we'll get started. Thank you for joining us. This is a partnership between Philanthropy California and the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, Angell. We are glad to have you all on board here in this second session of our Ethos series, the ethos behind trust-based philanthropy. This is on interpersonal skill building, the hardest skill building you'll ever do. So I just want to ground us in this moment today. It is quite a moment we find ourselves in. These are troubled times. We got on our prep call on Thursday, the day after an angry mob stormed the Capitol. Angry and armed mob stormed the Capitol. And we weren't in the best of spirits. We weren't in the best shape of mind at the beginning of the call. Our minds were somewhere else, far away from the importance of relationships. The statements we were drafting, the questions that we have, the existential dread of doing work in a field that originated through the oppression of folks of color and racial capitalism in this field, in which some moments makes us wonder if we're perpetuating more of the same. So as we made our way through that hardship, we explored how the content of this session, as we originally imagined it, relates to this moment. So we spoke about the power of relationships and what happens when we put our energy there, and how we pay attention to relationships during troubled times, which we've experienced so much over this past year. So relationships, resilience, adaptiveness, these are the crux of how we move forward in times like these. And often the first thing to go when we're stressed is our grace, our generosity, our vulnerability. So leaning into relationships where collective wisdom is more than an individual or a leader can do on their own is important. That means, I have to listen more. I have to be honest when I don't know the way forward. And none of us knows the way forward right now. So there are transformative possibilities when we pay attention to relationships. And centering relationships requires courage. The courage to speak honestly, the courage to really listen, and moral courageousness, which is a pillar of one of our speakers' work, Angell, Roberson Daniels from the Angell Foundation, which we'll hear more about in the rest of the session. So all of this really illuminates, again, the power of community, of being in relationship, and it enables us to be courageous to continue to push against this system that hasn't been designed for us to be in relationship in this way. These systems that we exist in uplift a leader knowing the answer. They uplift production and progress. And so the question really is, how in these times do we not default to the leader stepping in and having the answer, but rather the power and the potential of the relationships that we're a part of? So just acknowledging that, we're in all of that right now. These are hard times, and yet we're plugging forward with this session. So I just want to invite us into a few breaths together to find our way for this next 90 minutes together, so that we can have all of that still be the reality and the context that we're in, but also just be able to be here with each other. So an invitation to just find your seat and find your feet on the ground that connects to the earth, and the earth being in that which holds us. You can close your eyes if you'd like, if you feel comfortable. You can leave them open if not. And just really allow yourself to sit into your breath which is life force, which has so much power to calm or to animate. Feel that breath filling you up. From your feet to your legs, into your seat and your belly, into your chest and your head, up to the crown. And just taking a few really deep, intentional breaths here together. Letting them fill you up. And releasing it all as well. Take one more breath together. And let it go. Okay. Thank you. Welcome. We're glad to have you. So, I want to share a little bit about what we'll be doing together today. We'll be exploring the context that we operate in, and we'll be taking a storytelling approach. Throughout the commentary, speakers, in particular, Chris Murchison, who is our resident positive organizational culture expert and who's focused on team dynamics and relationships, will weave in practices and reflective opportunities that the speakers use to center and build relationships and to highlight the importance of practice. So this work is really, it doesn't just happen, and it is important to bring attention and intention. And throughout the practice of being reflective and thoughtful about how we want to center relationships, we can build our capacity to do so. So an invitation to have a pen and paper nearby. We will be doing reflective exercises. And finally, in the last two sections of the session, we'll be going into speakers' individual and organizational journeys around what it has meant for them and their organizations to build relationships into the center of their practice. So an invitation to use the chat to provide commentary on what speakers are saying, as well as to ask questions. Shadi will be moderating the chat and chiming in, and we'll work in questions at the end of each section and into the conversation. So with that, I just really want to introduce Angell Roberson Daniels, the ED of the Angell Foundation in Los Angeles, Ellen Friedman, Executive Director of the Compton Foundation in San Francisco, John Esterly, the Co-Executive Director of the Whitman Institute in San Francisco, and Chris Murchison, a positive organizational culture consultant and a scholar practitioner of positive organizational practices and team dynamics. So what we'll be doing today, we're exploring interpersonal skill building and the importance of relationships. We will hear from Ellen, John, and Angell a little bit further in, but first we're gonna hear from Shadi. We're gonna review our first session of this Ethos series, the ethos behind trust-based philanthropy. And then we'll hear from Shadi about a little overview of trust-based philanthropy. We'll look at the context in which we're operating in, the philanthropic context. And we'll be taking a storytelling approach and focusing on the impact of focusing on relationships in our grant making. And just acknowledging that trust is a big part of this. And next month's session in the Ethos series will focus on building trust within organizations, which is a huge part of what we'll be talking about today, the importance of doing this work within our organizations in order to be able to do it externally as well. So an invitation to use the chat for any commentary or questions as we go today. Shadi will be monitoring the chat, and we'll be bringing in questions at the end of each section. So we have 3 sections looking at the context, individual journeys with centering relationships, and then organizational journeys. And just to start us, I want to bring Ellen, John, and Angel and Shadi's voices into the room. And Chris, perhaps you can share as well if you had the chance to reflect on your I am. We're going to invite Ellen, who is the CEO of the executive director of the Compton Foundation, and John Esterly, the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, and Angell Roberson Daniels from the Angell Foundation, and Shadi Salehi, the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, to share their words of I am. So Ellen, good morning. We'll start with you.
Good morning. I'll share I'm really happy to be here and just feel the way you've set and started our conversation, that this will be a really rich opportunity for all of us. And I am fully present, but trying to hold the complexity of this moment and pay attention to my heart so that I can act fully in alignment with my values.
Thank you, Ellen. Good to have you here. John, let's go to you.
Well, great to be here, and thanks again for inviting me. I'll be succinct and just name the two words I put in, and I am anxious and hopeful.
Thanks, John. Angell, good morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. For me, I said I'm also anxious, but also curious. I'm really curious to see whether collective wisdom will prevail, or whether we'll see more collective folly on display over the next several weeks, if not months. So I'm trying to be hopeful.
Thanks. That's a practice too. Shadi.
I really appreciated the flow of prompts, because I am thinking and I am feeling, I echo a lot of the same sentiments. I had, anxious, scattered, sad. But then when I got to I am, it was like positive stuff. Like, I am ready, I am present, I am whole, I am part of a team. So I was kind of reminded of all the assets that we can lean on in these anxious times. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Shadi. Chris, do you have words to share, or did you not do that?
I did. I did it in advance. Gosh, I resonate with many of the words in the word cloud, but the three that I'm feeling right now are confounded and stretched thin emotionally, which is actually a lot of words, isn't it? And then, but also motivated. So I also felt the sort of juxtaposition of some heaviness, but also some hopefulness as well.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you all. Good to have you here. Shadi, I'm going to shift it over to you to share a little bit about the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and Trust-Based Philanthropy before we dive into the content of the session.
Great, thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
So really pleased to be here with you all today. This is the second of a series that we call the Ethos of Being Trust-Based. For those of you who may have been with us for the first series we did last year on the principles of trust-based philanthropy, this is an opportunity to really delve in more deeply into the values and dispositions that undergird a trust-based approach. So you see the definition of trust-based philanthropy here on the screen. At the core of this practice, it's about redistributing power and examining how it shows up systemically, organizationally, and interpersonally. So this Ethos series is really going to be building up, really starting at the individual level with the first session we did last month, and then building up to really having a systemic understanding of how power shows up and how we can be more conscious of it in this practice. So while trust-based philanthropy is really rooted in a number of practical principles of grant-making practice, there's a lot of kind of softer stuff that's hard to see that is really the interpersonal work on how you actually show up in a trust-based way. So this series explores that. There's no requisite for having attended past sessions. Each session builds upon the other and also references past and future sessions. We have the recordings that will be available. So this is really what the series explores. And we'll just go, actually, Kate, if you could just go to the next slide and then we'll wrap it up after that. So fundamentally, trust-based philanthropy is a values-based approach. You'll be hearing a lot about that in today's discussion. We see this work existing within an ecosystem wherein relationships are the crux of everything that we do. Without the relationships, we can't do this work well. So today we're really going to be digging into what that means to build strong interpersonal relationships and how to manage relationships across difference. So thank you for being with us. And I'll just hand it back to you, Kate.
Great, thanks, Shadi. So we just wanted to recap really briefly the first session because as Shadi shared, all this content really grows on each other. So the first session was called Permission to Pause. You have to go slowly to go far. And I'm just going to pull up the overview here. So the whole idea here is that we need to be reflective in terms of the work that we're doing. Reflection we're defining as observation, presence, awareness, and learning. Somebody noted the pause is where the morality lives. So really beautiful opportunity in pausing and reflecting. The power of embodiment and how things really land in our bodies. And we respond from an embodied state before we even have time to really think with our brains about what our response should be or what we want it to be. This integration of the inner and the outer, this relates to both our organizations, like we need to do the work internally before we can do it externally with stakeholders and partners, but also with ourselves, the inner and outer integration of soul and role, perhaps. The wholeness of being welcome here, like checking in with yourself, pausing to say, am I showing up in the way that I want to? Am I bringing all parts of my humanity into the room? And a really strong focus last session on racial equity and humanness, and not acknowledging that regardless of the what of our work, the outcomes are worse for communities of color, and we need to center that all the time. And the final thing that I want to lift up here is that, to Shadi's point, trust-based philanthropy is not a checklist, right? It's a liberatory practice of fighting for the human dignity of everyone in our ecosystems. And so that requires practice, which is what the opportunities that we're hoping to provide you with throughout this series. And finally, and really importantly, the end goal of this work is around the liberation of dollars in terms of our investments and our investments in communities as well. So really living into the values in every part of our organizations and the work that we do. So again, a moment of reflection. We want to invite you into 45 seconds of a free write here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can put this in the chat. What would your relationships with your grantees look like if you were to give yourself permission to pause? I'll put that in the chat here. So really think into your own personal practice. Are you already centering relationships? If you were to center them more, what would those relationships with your grantee partners look like? Take 15 more seconds. And as you finish up, we're going to do the same thing that we did last time and invite you to pick a few words, maximum 1 to 2 words that encapsulate your responses. And we'll do the same kind of word cloud here with the Mentimeter link that's in the chat. So take a few moments to enter 1 or 2 words that encapsulate your response, your free write to what would your relationships with your grantee partners look like if you were to give yourself permission to pause. All right, beautiful. I'm going to share my screen so y'all can see. Transparent, meaningful, thought partnership, thoughtful, stronger, respectful, wonderful. So a lot of these words are really beautiful representations of authentic relationship in my perspective. So just an invitation to hold on to that intention around pausing. Thank you all.
I just jump in quickly, Kate.
Yeah, please.
I just think that word cloud is so powerful, and it just makes me think about the possibility for transformation, like really transforming your relationships, literally just by slowing down and pausing so that different things can emerge. So I think when we're moving so fast in our world, we just skip over a lot of things or don't allow what might be in the room or in our organizations to really kind of come to their full potential. So I just love those words.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and we'll send these out so you all can print them out and put them up on your wall as a reminder. Thank you. Okay, we're going to jump into a question about context with our speakers now, what context we're operating in. So there's a human element that can get lost in this philanthropic context. We're focused on our to-do lists and our board meetings and getting the docket together. And so we're operating from the understanding as a panel of folks today that this work is countercultural. And we need to show up inside of a system that's set up to perpetuate power imbalances. So I want to talk, starting with you, Ellen, I think. You all are people who prioritize relationships and center them in your work. And we want to just explore what the context is that we're operating in here. And is it a context that's hospitable to relationship building? So Ellen, I know you think a lot about the larger systems that we operate in. Can you start us off with the exploration of the context that we're working in here?
Sure, happy to, and really excited about this conversation because I think one of the things, and Shadi, called it out in the definition of trust-based philanthropy, it does recognize that there are power imbalances existing in the fields in which we work. And that it is to center relationships and to try and have transparent, fun, joyful, honest relationships with people. We are doing countercultural work. The system that we work in is actually designed to maintain the power dynamic. And it is, it's kind of in the DNA of kind of a patriarchal, white supremacist structure that says one group of people actually should and has the right to control and hoard resources that should be, in my opinion, and many of our opinions, in the public sector. If people were taxed, if money was more equitably distributed, philanthropy wouldn't exist in the way that it exists today. So this system is set up to reinforce itself. So for us to begin to challenge at a very basic individual level power dynamics and to build a movement that is based on pushing back against that power dynamic, it is countercultural. But I would also pose that it is essential for us to understand the dynamics of the structure in which we're working in, because then we can't do the personal work we need to do to understand how that system shows up in us. How does it affect my ego? How attached am I to being inside of a foundation that whose offices are beautiful and comfortable and I can fly anywhere I want? I can't, but those are some of the structures in which we live in. And because we've all grown up in the system, this is the air we breathe. We actually have to understand how it shows up in ourselves. And so I think one of the things that has always fascinated me about this is that the line between what is work and what is life in trust-based philanthropy has to disappear, because I have to have the space to do my own personal interrogation of what are the things that show up in me that maintain that system, and what do I need to do personally in order to understand that so that I can act from a different place. So I think that's really, really important in understanding this part of the conversation. And the last thing that I'll say is that it's really hard to do it alone. I don't think you can. That to have valued colleagues who you link arms with, both grantees as well as funder colleagues, to struggle and hold ourselves accountable to acting in this way and moving these kinds of ideas and values and practices into the world is really, really important. And as Shadi said, it's not, and Kate both said, it's not a checklist. Yes, we can do these practices, but we need colleagues and allies who are holding us accountable to not just do the practices, but to show up differently inside of this system. So I'll stop there and we can talk more about that later.
Thank you, Ellen. Angell, moving to you. At the Angell Foundation, you all have done a lot, and you particularly too have done a lot of work to become a relationship, like you are a self-described relationship-based funder. Can you share with us how you felt about the philanthropic context in doing that work? Like, has the context been hospitable to you in that journey?
I would say it's becoming increasingly more hospitable, but no. I mean, when we started calling ourselves relationship-based funders, when we started doing the work, I don't think we had other colleagues in the space. So I think it's exactly what Ellen was saying. There wasn't a lot of appetite for that. I think it showed up in us hiring our staff, right? People coming from other foundations that were used to transactional approaches to grant making, didn't have the temperament or even the desire to maybe like take those pauses, right? It really takes a lot of additional work to move beyond transactions, to really move into being relationship based. And so, but I'm hopeful. I think I'm starting to see some movement, SCG, NCG, Trust-Based Philanthropy Project are starting to really have these conversations. We have, over 100 people on this call. And so I definitely believe that there's a shift taking place.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. Thank you. John, co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, pioneer of the trust-based philanthropy. You've been thinking about this and doing this work forever. Just anything to add to those contextual responses from Ellen and Angell from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, just underlining what they both said. I would just add and maybe just raise up right now that I think in terms of context, the issue of time really comes up a lot, both organizationally, individually over the years. You know, people go, oh yeah, relationships, great. But I don't have the time to do that. Or, yeah, relationship sounds great, but I've got 50 grantees in my portfolio. I've got 100 grantees in my portfolio. And so I think one thing, you know, that we'll be talking about, I think, the whole time is if you're centering relationships, if they are important, and that's a core value, then you do what you can in your place in the organization to help design an organization that actually makes that possible. And so that can be looking at grant making practices themselves, like with some of the trust-based philanthropy practices. I have found when you're giving unrestricted funding, when you're giving multi-year unrestricted funding, when you're streamlining paperwork, that actually frees up your time to be in relationship. And so when you're looking at your day, maybe even just very practical things that I have found helpful, just don't pack meeting after meeting. Bring some spaciousness to your meeting and not like, okay, we've got an hour, oh, we've hit the hour. You know what, just maybe if you're gonna think you're gonna meet with somebody for an hour, block out an hour and a half. So if your conversation is going, you can let it flow if that's working for the person you're with. So those are just, I think, some just examples that if we're centering relationships, we as Ellen, you know, said, how do we start acting on that from ourselves individually? And that, I think, calls us to look at both how we're showing up ourselves, the practices of our organization, and the culture of our organization. And then I would just add one other thing that I have found over the years, that it's an invitation to relationship, not a requirement. And so it's like what we would find is, oh, the Institute, that's great. They give unrestricted funding. They don't require the paper, but you have to be in relationship with them. God, they want to have, you know, lunch every month or something. So I think it's also opening yourself up that there's a whole spectrum of relationships that you will have if you open yourself up to centering relationships. And so hold the wide spectrum and complexity of that.
Thanks, John. Just saw a chat from Julie. It's so much more joyful than processing documents as well. So the joy, to be focused on joy. Thank you, Julie. Thank you all. Chris, any reflections from you upon listening to these responses?
Yeah, a few. First, you know, I'd love to have lunch with you, John. All of you, actually. Yeah, I had a few thoughts. Yeah, it just seems like we're in a time that there's just a loss of trust in institutions and in leadership, you know, even, you know, beyond philanthropy, but just in the world. And so this idea of trust feels even more important to me right now in the world. And paying attention to that through relationships feels important as well. I love the idea of kind of needing to demonstrate our trustworthiness and you know, doing that by slowing down, by pausing, by creating space for kind of those day-to-day rituals or opportunities to really kind of more authentically connect with people and have there be enough space to do that in a way that's meaningful for both parties. I love that thought. Yeah, I came across recently this concept from some psychologists where they distinguished between cognitive trust and affective trust. And I'd never heard that before. And so I just thought it was so interesting, just that distinction, that one can sort of have a cognitively based trust, which is, might be, how timely you are in following through on emails or meeting your grant making deadlines or other kind of very, to your words, Angel, more transactional things, that you do the transactions well, people can trust that, you will follow through on those things. But I think, there's an element of trust that we're talking about, which goes way beyond that, which is the affective or relational kind of trust. And so, by the way and manner with which you interact with me and make space to me or listen to me, are you demonstrating trustworthiness? And so I like that idea and the power of that kind of trust in particular.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Maybe we can include a resource or two on the differences there. That's powerful. Okay, thank you all. That's great for the context that we're operating in. Just invite folks to enter questions or comments into the chat. We'll be monitoring those and try to work those in. But moving into your, Angel, John, Ellen, your individual evolutions with centering relationships in your work. So as we've just explored, the context that we're operating in doesn't fundamentally or traditionally support relationship building as the crux of the work. So as we've said, this implies that the work of centering relationships is countercultural. So it requires both attention and intention to put relationships at the center. So before we begin this section, Chris, I'm going to invite you back in to lead us in some reflection as to our own individual attention to and intention with relationships in our work. So do you want to chime in here, Chris?
Yeah, so again, to just help us be kind of really thoughtful about the topic, we want to kind of do another space to invite you to reflect on this question. And so, as you think about your own work and your own relationships with grantees and also with your colleagues within your organizations, what do you do that builds trust? So as you think about, again, your relationships with your grantees in particular, but you might also extend that to your colleagues within your organization, what do you do? What do you specifically do? What do you concretely do that builds trust? Let's give you about 45 seconds to reflect on that. Just about 5 more seconds. Okay, so I'm just going to have you just hold those thoughts. We won't be doing any kind of polling or word cloud with this particular reflection, but we just wanted to kind of get you in the mind space around this question, and the panelists will be sharing their own thoughts about this.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thanks for everyone for going into that reflective space with us. So Angel, I'm going to start this one with you. Can you share the broad strokes of your own individual evolution with centering relationships in your work, including how you maintain awareness around power, privilege, and navigating across difference? And specifically, what are some of the practices that you recall and remember that enable you or have enabled you throughout the course of this journey to consistently center relationships?
Yeah, thank you. Well, broad strokes, I have a lot of details, so we can do another session on this. But I came to philanthropy after being a public health evaluator for quite some time, and so as you know, with evaluation, a lot of times there's a lot of fear built into that relationship between the nonprofit and the evaluator. And so, my work as an evaluator is really about building trust with the client um, and really helping them to reframe that fear about learning that something didn't work to embracing the possibilities of a framework of continuous quality improvement and looking at the feedback as an opportunity to continue to evolve and to move the work forward. And so, and then a major part of that also was around looking at program design and unpacking any assumptions around that were built into the program design, right? And what hypotheses or that the program design was based on, and really looking at what was at play that made things work and made things not work as planned. And so I tried to bring that same approach to philanthropy. The difference though is in philanthropy versus in evaluation that the privilege and power piece wasn't there. And so I learned very quickly that some of those skill sets were translatable, that I had to do a little bit of some different work. And part of what I did is try to show up and strip titles away very, very quickly and building relationships with folks. And so I would say the first practice is making space for the human to show up and not the title. And the way that you make space is really by starting to have real honest conversations around what brought each of us to this work, right? What keeps us up at night? What are we excited about? So to engage in that way before you even get into all of the other nitty gritty aspects of the transaction. And then there's another piece of me being self-aware, right? That now that I'm the philanthropist, my jokes are funnier. I have the best outfit, right? And being really self-aware of that and approaching everything with a little bit of humility. And then doing things like reading the room. And some of this may be, sound silly, but that means like not showing up to a site visit at a community garden with shoes that are too precious to get dirty. Not going to a preschool with a suit on where children might be touching you with their paint, right? So just being self-aware of every little piece of what you do is going to be kind of looked at microscopically, and being mindful of those things that may trigger an emotional response or may signal that there's a power dynamic at play, or that there's greater privilege in my position than in the organization or the applicant. The other thing is like being really transparent and naming the elephants. And so I know that there have been many times when I've just gone into a conversation and go, I know that there's an inherent power imbalance here. And can we just talk about some of your experiences working with other funders? What made you comfortable? What made you uncomfortable? What are some of the things that we can do in our relationship to avoid those things that made you maybe not feel listened to or valued or respected? And then also being honest about my own blind spots. Of saying, though I've done everything that I can to be knowledgeable about this community, the issues you serve, I know that I'm not expert here. Feel free to call me out if you feel like I'm making assumptions about some of the questions that I'm asking. And so like giving permission to not see me as so precious. Another thing that's really important to me is I call it, and me and my team talk about this all the time, the whole aspect of canceling the performance, right? So always telling people that we're in a relationship with, if it's an applicant, that it's not their job to entertain me. That is not their role. It is my job to learn about them, learn about the organization, learn about the communities that they serve, understand the dreams and aspirations for the community, and for us to figure out together how we can co-create a vision together, right? So to like cancel the performances. And then I would say the last thing, and this came from when I was an evaluator. You know, a lot of nonprofits really think about foundations, they don't say this probably unless you have a trusting relationship, as very small-minded, right? They tell you their big idea, and then what we do is we reduce their idea to the smallest piece that we can find. And so it's for me to continue to remain like big-minded, right? So as you know, people are talking about their dreams and aspirations, it is my responsibility not to tell them why it won't work or all the reasons that it's not a good idea, but how do I help to breathe a life into that idea, right? How do I cheerlead them and say, you know, that's a really great that's a really great idea. Can I connect you to someone else? You know, so it's remaining open to the possibilities that what they're actually looking to do is a real possibility and not something that is going to be on the chopping block immediately once they share it. So
Great. Such good examples of humility and transparency and good communication. Thank you for sharing. So let's go with you, John. Do you have any stories to share around your own individual evolution with centering relationships in your work and power, privilege, navigating cross difference?
Yeah, I guess I would maybe just start, you know, story-wise with, you know, because I've been at the Institute for a very long time, and that included working with the original founder and donor. And over my time working with him, I had more than my share of emperor has no clothes moments, moments of, you know, feeling like a glorified butler, you know, here's your idea for the day. And, you know, just seeing all these weird dynamics that can come with wealth and money. So when he passed away and I came into leading the foundation, I really wanted to approach our work from a spirit of service and approaching folks with a sense of, you know, we're in alignment with you. What can we do to serve you rather than what do you do to prove you're worthy of us? And when that was accompanied by an offer of unrestricted funding, something shifted, I think, around some of that inherent power dynamics. It doesn't completely go away, but it was mitigated. And then found over time when, especially when the unrestricted funding is multi-year unrestricted funding, that's a very concrete demonstration of trust. And then it drops down and okay, that invitation to relationships. So how can we learn together now? And how can we move forward? And so just, and then, you know, reinforcing a lot of what Angell said. And I think a commitment to humility and listening. And I think even with the power stuff, a recognition of, well, actually, my job is only meaningful because of the people we support. And so a recognition of their power in that, a recognition that we want this relationship to be reciprocal. And so that often also means not just listening, but also inviting feedback and acting on the feedback, maybe not always, but so I think another story for us was when we made the decision to spend out as a foundation. One of the first things we did was do a grantee perception report with CEP, and we asked our grantee partners, what are your ideas about how we best leverage our resources spending out? And we heard feedback from them that we have acted on. It was like, advocate for what you're funding. And even the framing of trust-based philanthropy came from what we heard from them. CEP said, you know, there's this theme that keeps coming up, and people say how important it is that they feel trusted by you. So I mentioned those because those are just two instances where you not only invite listening, but you act on what you hear. And one, you know, all these things have their own tensions. So, you know, the conventional wisdom in the field is, yeah, and we've all experienced, you become a funder, you're smarter, wittier, all that kind of stuff. And sometimes my worry is if people hold on to that too tightly, you become jaded. And so you're going, oh yeah, let's have an authentic relationship, but I don't really trust anything you're telling me, because you're just saying that because you want money. So you have to hold that, and you know, you feel your way through those. But I think for us as funders, it's what are we prepared to allow in? And I think that's something that we look at too. And sometimes what allowing in is also people's distrust, who have been burned in the past by funders, or they are communities that have a reason to be distrustful. And so not assuming that because I trust you, I automatically get the trust. So I think it's, you know, holding a lot of different tensions, and then just being able to, as much as possible, show up with humility and respect and vulnerability. And I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah, the acknowledgement of the trust goes both ways, right? And maybe we can try to speak to that a little bit of, you know, what do we do when there isn't trust from the grantee partner for important reasons, valid reasons. I'm just acknowledging that there is a great question in here from Susan Beaudry that Ellen, before your remarks, I'm just going to pop this in here. If you have the space to reflect on it, that's great. So the question is, what are your thoughts about balancing the ability to create spaciousness in your calendar with the challenge practitioners have with being overscheduled and having limits on spaciousness? And then Amy, I'm going to hold your question around dramatic growth in assets and giving for the organizational part of the conversation, which is coming next. So Ellen, do you want to share a bit about your journey with centering relationships, and if you can speak to that question as well?
Yeah, I'm so full of what Angell and John just shared, and want to add a couple of thoughts, maybe some different perspectives. So I started my journey in philanthropy after having been a community organizer and fundraiser for many years. And I actually decided to try and work in philanthropy because I was so pissed off at how I had been treated as a fundraiser, working on an issue that at the time was new and not kind of in the mainstream and was radical, which was the issue of violence against women, and how the program that I ran was treated by funders, not returning phone calls, not answering letters, or making a grant decision and not letting us know about it. And so so those early experiences really shaped how I tried to respond when I was lucky enough to get my first job as a program officer at a large foundation. And I was fortunate then actually to have a boss who was really instilled in us, return phone calls, return letters. This was way before email, return letters. And he made us sit down with grantees that we didn't fund and explain why we didn't fund them. And so while these weren't necessarily trust-based practices, they are trust-based practices because they start to instill a sense of respect. And so I was really lucky to have had that experience as a formative experience. But it was also in that role that I learned how not to do it, which was I'd come in to run a program related to violence against women. And because I'd worked in that field and been an organizer in that field for a long time, I knew exactly what needed to happen in that field. So all the things that John and Angell were talking about, you know, humility and all of that stuff, like I didn't have any of that. And I wasn't even really curious about how to implement my program because I knew exactly what we needed to do. That didn't work. And so it did teach me about how important it was, again, to like pay attention to myself. Like, you know, I didn't have all the answers. And as a funder, I was actually in a very, very different and actually quite powerful role that was kind of because of the structure that I was working in. And so that led me to actually a personal practice of meditation and of really having to do the hard personal work of checking my ego and checking my assumptions and trying to be present and thinking through and being open to where others were in my space. And it's led me to really understand that this work is both kind of about work and it's also spiritual work. It's like, who am I, like, in this world, and how do I enter every relationship with an open perspective, a sense of curiosity, humility, a recognition that there is like we're all interconnected. These kinds of values that, you know, are often nice to have, but how do they show up in me? And so if I didn't have a spiritual practice that keeps me grounded in this work, it would be so much harder to be available for the kinds of relationships. So maybe to Susan's question, I think the spaciousness comes also from how you schedule and all of that, but recognizing that we have to adapt to the realities of the people that we're working with. My schedule, I have more control over often than our grantees. If they need money, like we're in a process right now where we're issuing grant checks for multiple year grants without any reports, because we know that people in this moment don't have the time to do that. We just rescheduled. We were going to have all of next week grantee check-in phone calls. We just rescheduled all of them, like in 2 days, because we know that next week is going to be really challenging. We can do that. But our grantees were all expecting that they were going to have those phone calls. And we made it really easy for them. We pushed it all out a month. It's not, but we're issuing the checks. So like that is kind of coming from a recognition of what's happening elsewhere. And then I want to just say one more thing before stopping. And this is, for me, has been the hardest part of the pandemic. I think one of the most important practices is sharing food together. And it may seem like a side thing, but I actually think it's central because of how in the process of breaking bread together, we learn about each other. We have the opportunity to say, oh, what is your favorite food? Or what is, you know, you don't eat lunch? Okay, well, let's get together for X. There's a way in which food can open up our connections with one another. We have done a series of grantee convenings, small grantee convenings, all around lunch. And I know John and the Whitman Institute does that as well. And I think that that's actually an underappreciated way in which we enter relationship together, because it is about nourishing one another and about like appreciating, you know, a great salad or whatever. And those are not small things. Those are real things. They help to reinforce the way in which we are human together. And I think that's a really critical piece of how we show up together.
Yeah, thank you. Someday again, we will break bread together. It'll be beautiful. Thank you, Ellen, for sharing those stories. Thank you all. I'm going to invite Chris in. I think this point is really important, like our individual practices around the focus that we want to put on different aspects of our work. So, Chris, do you want to guide us here in some reflection around our own individual practice with centering relationships, and share any reflections you have yourself as well?
Sure. Yes. I have many reflections of my own. A couple of points I think I want to pull out. One is just all of you, Angel and Ellen and John, talked about humility, and I mean, I just sort of heard that as a thread and wanted to call that out, and it just seemed like such an important part of for funders to be aware of how we can be put on this kind of pedestal and how that influences the relationship dynamic in some negative ways. I was reminded in listening to your comments about that helpful checklist from Brene Brown. I think she calls it the checklist for knowing that you're prepared to receive or ready to give feedback. But I think her points in that list many of them relate well to the kinds of things that you were talking about. So for example, the first one on her list is, I'm ready to sit next to you rather than across from you. I'm willing to put the problem in front of us rather than between us or sliding it towards you. But there are just many points in her list here that I think resonate really well with the conversation that we're having. The other thing that I heard was around listening, the skill of listening, like really listening to another person and being able to hear what they're saying and act upon it. And the resource that comes to mind for me here is the skill that comes to mind for me here is the skill of generative listening. And Otto Scharmer out of MIT kind of gave some definition to that term, but it's kind of listening. It kind of goes beyond kind of the idea of active listening, and it kind of talks more about listening to create, listening in a way that you see the potential in the other person, and you're able to kind of, I think as Angel, you said, kind of breathe life into that idea, kind of create the space for that idea to really come forth and come to fruition, and you're kind of supporting that kind of person's highest future possibility. So again, I just think that came to mind to me as I listened to the panelists. So I think just again to kind of ground us in kind of our own experience, we want to take a moment to have you reflect a little bit more on your own relationship building experiences. So just maybe for the next minute, we'd love you to just continue to do some writing and maybe reflect on what you heard from the panelists and any more thoughts about the things that you do or maybe want to do that might support your own practice of relationship building. And then in there, you might also include some things that get in the way that you might want to pay some attention to and think about how to move those to the side. So again, it's kind of 2 points. What further thoughts do you have about building your own practice of relationship building? And then secondly, what gets in the way that you might also want to pay attention to? So we'll give you about a minute. I know that's not a lot of time, but it'll hopefully plant a seed that you can take away and continue to think about after today's session. Okay. Let's just take another 10 seconds here. And this is just private reflection for your own support. We won't be doing a poll on these. All right, thank you all so much. Back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so, if you have the time, to John's point about scheduling things for 30 minutes longer than you might think they go, if you have the time after this, just an invitation to continue writing on these topics and start your own practice of reflection there. So we're going to shift into a more organizational question. And there, I'll share two questions that came through in the chat, but we want to explore, John, Angel, and Ellen, what is meant for your organizations to get to the point of being relationship-based funders. Angel, you kind of started this in the first question about context, but specifically, like, what does this mean for your grant making, right, and your relationships with your grantees? And I just want to plug two questions before I go into specific questions for you all. So Amy Jester asked, when is it that we are cultivating trust in our organizations versus trust between the people that are working together? And then Betsy Fairbanks asked, we're looking at a dramatic growth in assets and giving. We're struggling with centering relationships and with more grants. Yes, they will be bigger, but there will also be far more. So the question is, what of the tension between hiring adequate staff to allow for valuable relationships with each other versus making more funds available? Regranting is an option for some of the additional money. What else do you suggest with this tension? So just hold, if you three can hold those questions as you think about your remarks. Angel, let's start with you. If we can get a little more specific about your organizational journey, you've done the work to define what being a relationship-based funder means for you. We've spoken in prep calls about language, shape-shifting, asking open and honest questions. Can you share more with us about your journey and what the impact has been on your grant making?
Sure. So really quickly, so our foundation was born of a tragedy, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And so our initial kind of foray into grant making was really based in that morning. All of the people that we were in relationship with, of course, there was deep resonance with that tragedy. And so we would literally have site visits and people would cry, right? And so it was a matter of, they felt that they were taking care of us because we were shepherding this memory of, a wonderful couple who had lost their life in such a tragic way. And to be honest with you, that was emotionally exhausting and was not sustainable in terms of building a relationship based on that as the thread. And so we really wanted to spend some time kind of rethinking our origin story, and not being so much about how our founders lost their lives, but how they lived their lives. And so, that began a journey for us of what does it mean to have a foundation that's really an embodiment of an individual couple's values and the way that they were seen in the world. And we heard wonderful things about how humble they were and how much integrity they had and how great listeners they were. But the challenge was, what does that look like in an organizational context? And so we went on a learning journey. It was a 2-year learning journey. Well, actually, it's still ongoing, but we did a really intense 2-year learning journey of unpacking that. What does it mean for Angell Foundation to be relationship-based? And it sounds cheeky, but we did a long dating process with one another, and also with 13 of our grantees, with an initiative called Organizational Spirituality. And so, Brian Stevenson always talks about getting proximate. We could not get any more proximate than being in a process with 13 nonprofits that were represented by their board, their staff, and their chief executive. And Through that process, we learned everything from issues of power and privilege. We talked about it. We talked about our own bias, the experiences and pieces of our identity that shape our individual worldviews and how it shows up in our organizations. We learned new listening techniques. We talked about open and honest questions. So we learned from Parker Palmer and the Center for Courage and Renewal, how to employ open, honest questions. We did a lot around self-awareness and self-reflective practices. But mostly we also learned to listen really intently to the challenges that nonprofits have. We spend a lot of time as foundation staff musing about nonprofits and what they should do and what they could do. And a lot of that was dispelled, I would say, in that 2-year process. And so, what it really did is it allowed us to show up in those conversations more vulnerable. You talked a little bit about moral courage. That is what I think that really took hold for us in our foundation, right? It's really easy when we were working to understand where there are moments for collective wisdom to arise, but also how easy it is for collective folly, collective foolishness to take hold, not only for an individual, but how it can actually proliferate an entire organization. And that, you can have full alignment and all types of things that really sometimes can damage your organization's ability to do its best work. And there has to be something in the process for somebody to say, I want to go against this, like flag on the play. The way that we're talking about this community is, has some racist undertones to it, right? Or the reason that we did not approve that grant was based on a lot of bias and false assumptions. And so because we did that, it really, I would say, has created a real reciprocity in our relationship with one another, but also with our grantees. And it's also resulted in us really looking at all of our processes. We don't ask questions that we don't need to know. We don't ask for extraneous paperwork. All the things I talked about before in terms of, not looking at our relationship with our grantees as another entertainment vehicle for us. That is not the way we find our joy. We find our joy by the work we do in the world. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll stop there. I have so much more to share, but hopefully we'll get a chance in the future.
Thank you, Angel. It's amazing to hear about the power of the origin story and the need to reshape that based on the sustainability for the future, or to use that in sustainable ways. Thank you for sharing that. Ellen, one more question for you on this. You went through a hard moment when you became aware that Compton had a bit of work to do to be more reliable partners, owing to some tensions between your board and your staff. Can you tell us that story and what you did to address it and how it impacted your grant making?
Yeah, and I'll be brief, but I think, and this goes a little bit maybe to Betsy's question, I think one of the lessons I learned from that is that inside-outside alignment between staff and board, organizational alignment is key, actually, and it is one of the challenges with trust-based philanthropy when some people are working in that way and other people are not, and the system isn't structured in a way that allows you to be all moving together in partnership. And for us, what happened was there became a split. We're a family foundation. There was a split in the family about the future of the foundation that resulted in almost a 2-year kind of conflict about what were we going to do? What was our grant making budget going to be? Whether we needed staff or not. And we had already made the decision to do multi-year grants, to make them unrestricted. We had been out, working with colleagues on different collaboratives. And when this tension, which had been simmering for a while, kind of really blew up, we had to pull back. We didn't know as staff what we could do. We couldn't, and we also couldn't really talk about it. So we were having these rather cryptic conversations with our grantees and with our foundation colleagues. And we just kind of disappeared for about a year because I didn't feel like we could be trusted partners. We continued with our grant making, and we, tried to do what we could to keep the essential part of our work moving, but we couldn't live into the desire to be fully transparent about what was going on. The good news is that the conflict has resolved, and in the last 18 months, particularly as a result of our decision to spend out, we have been able to fully embrace these practices and work with our grantee partners to figure out what is the best strategy for ending our relationships. We've made much longer grants, unrestricted grants. We're eliminating paperwork, as I've said in the past, but we're also trying to advocate in the field for spending out for these kinds of practices. And because I now have and can trust internally alignment between staff and board, it allows me to do things like this, to talk about what we're doing. And I think that what is really, really kind of my takeaway lesson is that in this field, we don't talk about the conflicts very often. Because again, it's part of the power dynamic. But many of us are working inside of systems and organizations where there is conflict. And it is really difficult, I think, to implement trust-based practices if we don't actually know how to do conflict better and talk about it and lean on one another to help resolve it.
That's such an important point, the importance of managing conflict, being good at that skill building around that. Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of more minutes here. John, I know that your journey has been long. Are there any, I'm gonna not ask for a story here, but are there any particular points that were transformational for you at the Whitman Institute that you feel like you want to uplift in this question about your organizational journey?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, just very quickly, I'm thinking of the word cloud at the beginning and how prominent transparency was.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's really important to strive for clarity when you're meeting with people and not have them leaving the conversation going, I'm not sure what happened. I'm not sure if I'm going to get support or not. What I have heard over the years is people appreciate hearing a clear no rather than a mushy maybe. So I think just being transparent about expectations for conversations. I would say, I talked about time at the beginning, and now we're about running out of time. So I would also just say to, like today, to hold building relationships as not one conversation, but conversations over time. And so my experience has been when you support people over time, you create more opportunities for deeper and richer relationships that are meaningful to both people in the relationship or both organizations. And so I guess it's an argument for intimacy over time rather than serial dating. Yeah, and I think we're about at time, so I'll just but thanks again for everybody for being on the call. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Yeah, holding the tensions. We want to honor folks' time. So Thank you all for a rich session. Just want to particularly thank our partners in Philanthropy California at Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties, the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and Southern California Grantmakers. Deep gratitude to you, Angel, Ellen, John, and Chris for sharing your thoughts and being so engaged in what is a difficult and troubled time. For all of you, thank you for joining us and sticking with us. We'll send out a follow-up email plug for that survey, just taking a couple minutes right now that's in the chat. Thank you all for being with us. Our next session in this series will be in March, and we'll send that out in the follow-up email with a link to register if you're not already. Deep gratitude to you all. Take care, be well. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.